Okay. So thank you. It was an opportunity for me to think about a whole sort of academic lifelong of methods and how important that is to me. In fact, almost more of a salient thread in my academic work than any content area. So since I styled myself, I identified with psychosocial, I've thought of myself as having a stable of 4 methods, psychosocial methods, which have been building as I've gone along. Actually, one of the lovely things about this conference is that I see how many psychosocial methods are being described here. And I think our stable of methods is expanding fittingly. Being trained as a psychologist, I've believed for a long time that if your methods are bad, then all your findings are worthless, or actually more dangerous than worthless even, and that it's crucial to have methods with which you can ask questions. I was trained obviously in positivism and quantification and all of that stuff. And I vividly remember that in my undergraduate dissertation, I was so demoralized by the fact that by the time I'd finished using the methods that I had available to me, the question that I had posed had lost all its interest and meaning. It was like dead on the page. And I think that was a very important bit of learning for me, and fueled my critical psychology and feminist psychology and qualitative psychology, and turning into my psychosocial eventually. My stable of methods are free association narrative interview, FANI for short, psychoanalytic observation, visual matrix, and social dreaming matrix. And I'm really not going to say much about them except to try and trace this connection through association. Now, it's really handy that the free association narrative interview has association in the title of the method. But it was indeed a sort of light version, I think, of association. Light in that derogatory sense that we use, L-I-T-E. Because really it was an interview, a standard, well, it wasn't standard, it was a qualitative interviewing method informed by feminism, which meant that you respected the voice of your participants. You didn't structure it too much, and you didn't code and quantify it further down the line. But I realized, and this was the story in the book that I wrote with Tony Jefferson, that we were, by the questions we were asking, we were actually providing the direction of the answers that people would give us. And it just, you know, it was just rather like a virtuous or vicious circle of knowledge. And with free association narrative interview methods, at least we enabled people to move from one idea to another through association. But it was nonetheless structured as a narrative, and a biographical narrative even when I first learned it. And so that in itself was reliant on talk. And one of my criticisms of the free association narrative interview is that it was still talk heavy. And the other is that its analytical focus is the individual. So I moved on, but all this while I had in the back of my mind a book that I'd read when I was in my 20s by Georges Devereux called From Anxiety to Method in the Behavioral Sciences. And I'll just quote you a line from it, because I think it was sitting there deep in me, digesting probably for about 20 years. He says, back in 1967, psychoanalysis should be seen first and foremost as an epistemology and a methodology. Now, for trained psychoanalysts, that's not really in a way difficult, because the knowledge, the way that we gain knowledge through transference, countertransference is just that. And it has that capacity to get at the unthought known. But when he was talking about social behavioral science methods, and it was only when I kind of added free association to the narrative interviewing method that I realized that here was a use of psychoanalysis. But the next one was Psychoanalytic Observation, and it was borrowed directly from the Tavistock in observation and child observation. Only I managed to get some funding which enabled it to be used in a research capacity for understanding the identity changes involved when women become mothers for the first time. And that was an improvement, because it moved from the individual to something relational. It moved its focus from talk to embodiment. And it also moved away from discourse to practice, looking at what people were doing. But in processing the data, or producing and processing the data in a group, it also was very heavily reliant on reverie as a form of actually letting the notes come through you, and always foregrounding the question, what is this making me feel? How do I visualize the scene? And by that time, I'd been to Dubrovnik often enough to be highly influenced by depth hermeneutic method. And I think it took me years to understand how important the concepts of scene and scenic understanding were. Some of you here will have been part of that, that learning, definitely. But that too enabled me to think about my methods as needing to help the scene emerge. And in psychoanalytic observation, one of the things that the notes do is actually paint something scenic. And then that is reconstructed in the seminar group by the more felt scene. So those are the first two methods. And I used them together in the book Knowing Mothers. And they complemented each other in very interesting and useful ways. And of course, the next two are a pair as well, visual matrix and social dreaming methods to a great extent. I know Lynn's already been talking about a particular use of the visual matrix this morning, so I'm going to skip over that. But it's a way when you can't actually use dreams of using images, and of course images are very closely related to something scenic and to reverie. It's often visual. So we're still moving in this direction of a kind of thinking that's freed from intention, freed from agency, freed from plan, and to something which emerges if you provide the space for it to emerge. And of course, I hardly have to tell you lot that that is so against and in conflict with the way social science methods have been for the last all these decades. And I think it's still, it's not just different, it's shocking and transgressive for the vast majority of researchers to even imagine that something you produce that way is going to have validity. And of course, you have to re-theorize objectivity and subjectivity and all of the other concepts, dogmas that came with science when it was applied in social science. And so, along with the actual pieces of research, I've been really interested to continue to kind of write about the changed epistemology of these associative methods and what that actually means for all of the rules that still are dominant, and the ones that I was trained in, obviously. But social dreaming was the decisive move from a framing around the individual to a framing of the social, but not social in the dualistic sense of individual social, but social in the collective group and societal sense. In fact, I often wish that it was called psychosocial dreaming, because individual and social are still produced as a binary. It's still extremely difficult to think outside that binary, even though we're all busy trying all the time with whether we use the hyphen or not. And I think social dreaming does it. I really do. So that is such a kind of radical freedom to move away and to listen to people's dreams, and it doesn't matter whose dream it is, because it changes, it morphs in the context of the matrix and alongside all those free associations, which sometimes, not today, but often include images from film, novel titles, theatre scenes, just a whole lot of kind of cultural references of that kind, pop songs, you name it. So it's cultural. It's very socio-cultural as well. And I was interested to see in that quote from Gordon Lawrence that actually I found from one of Julian's writings, that he included spiritual in the list of layers that the social dreaming matrix could open. But anyway, in practice, we are able to focus on the dream and not the dreamer. I hope you had that feeling today. And so you're free from the individual as a unit of analysis completely, right from the framing of the method. And that helped me. I mean, as a psychologist and as somebody with the free association narrative interview and everything, I always ended up going back to the individual, even though I tried to make the context and environment and setting and scene social. And so I think that was what was so exciting for me about social dreaming. And then, of course, it doesn't just get at the social that we are conscious about. The most important thing about it is it gets at what you might call the social or collective or socio-cultural unconscious. It doesn't, I don't really care what we call it, because the dream ensures that you have access to things that you didn't know you knew. And so back to the unthought known of my starting point, which is a way of actually bringing into emergence what we don't know we know, but together, and not just together as a group, but socio-culturally. And that's why it's such a useful method for approaching difficult to think subjects that are uncomfortable or erased for socio-cultural reasons, or are just too painful and frightening to think, like climate catastrophe. So I'll finish there. I think I've just about done my 15 minutes, and I think we'll go straight on to Julian and then bring it all together in half an hour's discussion.
I've just
Julian,
noticed,
over to you.
I have just noticed that Anne Liveng has raised her hand.
Oh.
Do you have a question now, Anne, or do you want to wait?
No, I'm sorry. I think it's a mistake. I'm struggling to get it down again.
Okay.
Just push the reactions button and.
Yeah. I put the phone in my pocket, and then when I took it up, I realized that I raised my hand. But
okay, it's a pocket question.
I think I can be the Chinese authoritarian here and actually lower your hand.
That will be perfect.
As a host.
Yeah, fine.
To have all the digital power, Birgitta.
Yes.
It's not healthy.
Okay, so please, Julian, it's your moment.
Okay, thanks. Yes, interesting that Wendy ended up there by talking about, oh, it doesn't matter if it's a social unconscious or the collective unconscious and so on. Interestingly enough, thinking on that has been developing for years in social dreaming. And in the book that Susan Long and I edited on social dreaming recently, the last edited volume on social dreaming, we talk about the associative unconscious. And I talk about associative thinking. So that fits directly into the theme of our thinking at the moment, which is association. The idea being that the associative unconscious is an unconscious that exists through associations, and that is what binds the thinking together and creates the dream and not the dreamer type social collective. I'm going to talk a little bit, well, I'm going to talk briefly about my thoughts in developing social dreaming theory by bringing in theories from Deleuze and Guattari. It seems to me that the kind of work that Deleuze and Guattari were involved with can provide interesting developments and insights into psychosocial work. And so this is the kind of thing I've been thinking about recently. So I'll be talking about language, association, and dreams. So I'm going to begin by suggesting that an enduring problem with psychosocial work is our dependence on language to reach understandings. And Wendy, of course, as she's described, discusses that in Knowing Mothers as something that tends to edge us, researcher and research subject, towards the cognitive and rational in an interviewee's response, despite the release of free association in Fanny interviews. And this is because language is a cognitive thought process. When Wendy wrote Knowing Mothers, infant observation provided a balance to this through the observation of affect, through embodiment, and through observation of the relationships between body and environment. So in Knowing Mothers, we see that despite the problems of language and free association, it was possible in that work to balance this out with attention to embodied affect, as in observed in infant observation. So what have Deleuze and Guattari got to do with any of this? I think it's curious that as philosophers, maybe there's an expectation that language of the rational kind would be especially important to them. And for the British philosophical tradition, I'm not sure about other traditions, but for the British philosophical tradition, Deleuze is often scorned or ignored precisely for not being attentive to logic as the major tool of philosophy. And I think that therein lies the clue to what Deleuze and Guattari can provide for us. Because the work of Deleuze and Guattari goes beyond the logic of thought and on to what Deleuze called, and this is the title of one of his books, the logic of sense. That's to say that Deleuze and Guattari start where Wittgenstein's language games begin, where Wittgenstein discusses the special game of dreaming, how dreams bring us to the limits of language and reasoning through language by presenting impossibilities or absurdities together in images. So this is a quote from Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations. He says, what this language, he's talking about dream language now, what this language primarily describes is a picture. What is to be done with the picture, how it is to be used, is still obscure. Quite clearly, however, it must be explained if we want to understand the sense of what we are saying. One of the most important features of social dreaming is the rendering of pictures or visual images through language, precisely moving on from Wittgenstein's special game of dreaming, but with a heavy accent on images and affect associated with those dream images. The nature of these images is inevitably from the unconscious because they arise from dreams. They are, as it were, the deeper images that encapsulate the known that is yet unthought, brought into thought perhaps through a Bion-like beta and alpha process. Ironically, and this is fascinating to me, although Wilfred Bion was famous for his little book on experiences in groups, which he himself didn't like and thought it was one of his worst books, but is one of his most popular books, Bion never made the link between group and his theory of thinking. And this is the leap, the connection between group and Bion's theory of thinking. This is the leap that happens in social dreaming. In Deleuze and Guattari's book, Anti-Oedipus, which is such an annoying book for so many people have told me how much they hate Anti-Oedipus. Deleuze and Guattari praise the work of Melanie Klein. Actually, you know, many people hate Anti-Oedipus but have never read it. Actually, they talk in depth about Melanie Klein, and they suggest that the problem with Melanie Klein is that her work falls short by concentrating on a Freudian tradition of pathologizing individual expression of the unconscious. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari see traditional psychoanalysis as being terminally linked to language, with the psychoanalysis of the individual working in tracing lines to a single past and uncovering a particular hidden truth translated into binaries of good and bad. The arguments are too complex in 1,000 Plateaus and Anti-Oedipus. The arguments are too complex to enter into now, but the point is that as an alternative, Deleuze and Guattari suggest a rhizomatic way of thinking that they exemplify through the idea of mapping and cartography rather than linear tracing. And in this respect, they're damning of Chomsky's linguistics. In moving on towards a definition of an alternative and, to them, a better way of using the unconscious, Deleuze and Guattari move on to describe what they call schizoanalysis, which favors the creative and unending process of accepting conscious and unconscious, internal and external, animate and inanimate combinations as a means of creating a synchronistic or holistic understanding of humankind's existence in context. This they called nomadic thinking, where associations nomadically float without a preconceived direction, and they find meaning through unexpected rhizomatic connections that are felt, or Deleuze would say sensed, rather than thought. Hence, the nightmare of trying to read 1,000 Plateaus diligently, cover to cover, by the thoughtful scholar. And this is what I tried to do when I first tried to read it. Deleuze and Guattari themselves warn against such a futile act. They just themselves describe the structure of their book as made up of plateaus, hence the title 1,000 Plateaus. And they state, each plateau can be read starting anywhere and can be related to any other plateau. And they called their book an image book. So for anyone who's been engaged with and bothered by the epistemology of social dreaming, the parallels should be clear. And in this way, I'm claiming that social dreaming can be understood as a Deleuzian method. The dreams are presented in a linear fashion because we have no choice, Similarly, Deleuze and Guattari provide us with books that start at page 1 and continue on page 2. But as the matrix proceeds, the linearity of the sequence of time gives way to a sense of interconnectivity that is more rhizome-like. It's not unusual for a dream or association made at the end of a matrix to find its strongest connection to a dream or association at the beginning. Indeed, it may resonate with more than one dream or association, and in this way, creating a rhizomatic pattern. Furthermore, these rhizomatic connections are not all equal in intensity. Some appear to be stronger, some weaker, not in meaning, but in what Deleuze and Guattari would call in intensities of affects. So understanding emerges through the combining of these intensities rather than through a rationalizing a thinking process. The dreams themselves make creative conglomerations possible, what Deleuze and Guattari call compossible, a feature of dreams that Freud called condensation. It's through this effect of dreams and the way associations link the dream images and affects into a rhizome that the participant in social dreaming can, as it were, see the bigger picture, even when this picture is normally unseeable, as for example in the Mortonian hyperobject, something which is so big, so massive that we can't actually see it. And this is also how connections are made between the animate and inanimate worlds. An example of this would be, and I'm quoting now from a matrix that Wendy and I ran together, an example of this would be the Plastic Snowman invented by the figure Great Aunt Vera in a dream from a social dreaming matrix that we analyzed in the chapter that we wrote together that was pre-distributed. The snowman is a combination of a human being, water in the form of snow, and plastic, and it has a natural energy function. So I'm just going to quote this dream to you, otherwise it won't make any sense. I remember hearing that a friend's great aunt Vera was driving and that she shouldn't because she's so frail, and I had to do something about it. But I didn't know where she lived, apart from the fact that it was in Devon. So I went to a local post office store and asked the lady there if she could help. She said she was bound to know someone who could track her down. She went to the back office of the shop and came out again and said, "Sorry, we haven't been able to find Vera, but I believe she isn't driving, but rowing down a river." I said, "Vera? Rowing down a river? She's far too frail for that." Apparently, the way she'd done it was she had an inflatable snowman in the bow of the boat with 2 ropes attached to it. And if she pulled the snowman forward and let it go, it sprung back and rowed the boat. And that's the end of the dream. So if the dreams themselves are intensities of affect, associations are the nomadic lines that disconnect or connect and reconnect them through the spontaneous actions of thoughts and images, landing as if by chance in the gaps between the dreams and their image affects. And maybe those gaps between the dreams are the gaps in the clay pot that have been cracked and filled by the golden filling in our own matrix. The associations provide an indication of how Deleuzian multiplicities might be interlinked without stasis in definition. The rhizome and the social dreaming matrix is always in movement. Indeed, reports from participants in social dreaming often describe a sense of continuation after the matrix is over. And this is why Gordon Lawrence, who discovered, as it were, social dreaming, always worked with what he called the working hypothesis, although he never made a Deleuzian frame out of it. That's to say, a hypothesis that will never be definitely concluded. And this is another way of understanding the unconscious in social dreaming as Sphinx-like rather than Oedipus-like, which Lawrence borrowed from Wilfred Bion. The Sphinx provides a sense of eternal knowledge puzzle, even though it isn't without sense, while Oedipus provides a path to the unconscious pathologies of the individual. And finally, for such a short talk, the associations that flow in the matrix are what produces a level of understanding through Deleuzian becomings. Maybe we can identify examples of this in our own matrix. To take a published example that Wendy and I found captivating, that example that I've just read, the dream that features great Aunt Vera, I personally found myself becoming Aunt Vera in affective resonance with the invention of ecological power as an alternative to fossil fuel destruction, the ecological power being that of the inflatable snowman on the river. So I felt I was becoming that idea and that it might provide a solution to the climate emergency. I was becoming plastic, becoming air, becoming snowman. And the way this works is because the sense of this, to my understanding, was affective rather than rational. In a rational sense, this makes no sense. In an affective sense, it makes all the sense in the world. And so I could become that, and I could create new thoughts. And that's one of the ultimate aims of social dreaming, is to create new thinking, create new thoughts, which rational, linear, sequential thinking fails to do through various defenses and anxieties that come to mind. And I think I'll end there. I've got no idea, Birgit, if I've run under or over or on time.
I think it's very well done and very interesting. Thank you very much, both of you.